Welcome to Case by Case. We want to just take a moment and remind you that this content is intended for adult audiences. It is created for educational and informational purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as discussions may include references to real criminal cases, violence, and other sensitive and potentially distressing topics. While we strive to present every case with accuracy and respect those involved, the material may not be suitable for all viewers. Please proceed thoughtfully. And remember, if you need to take a step back, if you find something that concerns you, if you find it to be triggering and you need to take a step back, please do. You can join us whenever you're ready to come back. We'll leave the light on. It was 1981. Pop music was everywhere, blasting from car radios, cassette tapes spinning in every teenager's Walkman. Classic rock was still just called rock. Movies shaped the way we dressed. Denim jackets, feathered hair, bright colors, and there was rebellion in the air. Reality shows didn't exist. There were no cell phones, no internet. Life was slower. There were no video games. Kids stayed outside until the streetlights came on, riding bikes, skating, hanging out in parking lots, walking to the store, and goofing off until someone's mom finally yelled that it was time to come home. It was a good time to grow up. At least that's how it felt. But 1981, it was also a turning point, because underneath all that music, color, and freedom, the world was beginning to change. A darker side of America was showing itself, one that most families had never imagined could touch them. For those of us who were kids or teenagers then, we remember it well, the sudden fear that crept into every household. The stories on the evening news that made parents start locking doors, watching windows, and keeping a closer eye on their children. In the true crime world, 1981 was the start of something frightening, a shift. A realization that the innocence we thought we had, the safety we believed in, wasn't as solid as we hoped. And it all began with one little boy, a single trip to a store with his mom, and a tragedy that would change America forever. Welcome to Case by Case. This is the case of Adam Walsh. Hollywood, Florida, July 27th, 1981. It was a normal Monday, the kind of hot, sticky day when the Florida air clings to your skin and the sun glares off every car in the parking lot. Inside the Sears department store, shoppers browsed for back-to-school clothes, tools, and home goods. Sears was once a top store throughout much of the United States. And among those shopping at the Sears store was Adam Walsh, 6 years old, and he was tagging along with his mom. They were running errands, nothing special. Reve, his mother, needed a lamp. Adam just wanted to look at toys. Like most moms in 1981, she felt safe letting him wander a few aisles away. The toy section was right next to the lamp department, close enough to hear his voice if he called out. Adam spotted something exciting. A group of older boys crowded around a new Atari video game display. See, in 1981, we didn't have the video games that every household has now. We had a brand new Atari video game that was just coming out. It hadn't even made the mainstream yet. Most people didn't know about it. But this caught Adam's attention, and he asked if he could stay and watch, and she agreed. A few minutes later, she came back. Adam was not there. At first, there was no panic. Maybe he'd wandered off to another aisle. Maybe he went back to look in the toys. She checked the bikes, the sporting goods, even the restrooms. He wasn't there. Minutes turned into longer minutes, and with each step, the unease grew. She found a store employee and asked for help. Security began scanning the aisles, calling Adam's name. Then one of them remembered something. They'd just told a small group of boys to leave the store for playing too loud by the video game display. A little boy, younger than the others, had followed them out, quiet and polite, like he didn't want to get in trouble. He walked out the north entrance. No one saw which direction he went. That boy was Adam. At 12:55 p.m., when Adam was missing, a code Adam did not yet exist. Amber alerts had not been created. There was no store-wide alert, no lockdown, no immediate call to neighboring police, because in 1981 there was no such system. His mother, Reve, searched the parking lot calling his name. Employees looked inside cars, under cars, behind counters, anywhere a child might hide. By late afternoon, panic had set in. Police were called. But back then, missing children were often treated as runaways, even when they were very young. And sometimes they were simply treated as lost. It was believed that children rarely got kidnapped by strangers. That just didn't happen in 1981. Investigators arrived, but they didn't close off the area. Shoppers continued to come and go, and whatever evidence might have been there, a car, a person watching, was lost in the chaos. Hours later, there was still no sign of Adam. When night fell, the Walsh home became a place of quiet terror. Every ring of the phone brought hope and then heartbreak. Tips came in from people who thought they'd seen a little boy matching Adam's description, but each one ended the wrong way. Wrong child. As days turned to weeks, posters of Adam's face were everywhere. Telephone poles, in shop windows, on the evening news. A blonde-haired little boy with bright eyes and a shy smile. People across Florida joined the search, but nothing. Then on August 10th, 1981, 2 weeks after he went missing, a fisherman in Vero Beach, roughly 120 miles north, made a discovery that would stop the nation in its tracks. He found the severed head of a small child in a drainage canal. Dental records confirmed it was Adam Walsh. The rest of his body was never found. In that moment, something shifted in America. Parents who once felt safe began holding their children closer. Communities that thought things like this don't happen here realized they could, and they did. The innocence of 1981 was gone. Once Adam was found, the whole world just stopped for the Walsh family. News crews were everywhere, police were everywhere, but answers there weren't any. And honestly, that might have been the hardest part, not knowing. From day one, the investigation was a mess. And remember, this is 1981. Police did not know how to handle situations like this, not because they weren't trained to be good investigators, but because these types of crimes just did not happen. And most of the time, when a child was missing, that child was lost, not abducted. That child was lost or a runaway and would be found. So police really did not have a standard operating procedure to handle something like this. News crews were everywhere. Police were everywhere. But from day one, where the investigation was a problem, nobody seemed to really be in charge. One department thought another had it, leads got lost, evidence went missing. And back then there was no DNA. There were no surveillance cameras in the stores. There was no national database. There were no cell phones. There was no real quick way to look things up. This was back in the day when if you wanted to call someone, you got what was called the Yellow Pages, a big thick book, and you looked up companies. And if it was a person instead of a business, you got the White Pages. And the White Pages were much thicker than the Yellow Pages, and you had to just hope that person had not moved since it had been printed the last time. That was 1981. So police had to go on what was basically paper reports, phone calls, and gut instinct, things they had learned when they became police officers. All the while, John and Rive were just sitting there, trying their best to survive the worst pain any parent can imagine, trying to make sense of all this, trying to figure out exactly what happened and getting no answers. Because although they knew Adam was not coming home, they still wanted answers. They wanted to know what happened to their son. They wanted to know how it happened. And there were so many questions that loving parents have in their mind, and these are the things that plagued them. But if there's one thing you'll learn about John Walsh, it's that he doesn't sit still. He started asking questions. He started pushing, meeting with anyone who would listen. He wasn't a cop, a detective, or a lawyer. He was just a dad who wanted someone to do their job. He met with former FBI agents. He spoke to the behavioral science unit. He learned everything he could to try to understand this situation and what had happened to his son Adam. A couple of years later, the name Otis Toole pops up. Now, if you don't know who that is, you're lucky. He was a drifter, convicted killer from Jacksonville, Florida, who ran with another monster, Henry Lee Lucas. Neither one of them were any good. Neither one of them should have ever been around people, much less kids. And to give credit where credit's due, Henry Lee Lucas's mother completely messed him up. Abuse like you've never even heard of before. Beating him in the head, throwing him out in the snow while his head's bleeding open, knocking out his eye. I mean, a lot of things that she did and a lot of things she allowed to happen. It was unbelievable the type of abuse this child went through, and he grew up to be a monster. And so did his buddy Otis Toole. In 1983, Toole suddenly confessed to kidnapping and murdering Adam Walsh. He said he lured him from the Sears parking lot, drove north, and then he panicked when Adam started crying, so he killed him. It was a horrifying story, and it lined up with some of what investigators already believed. But then, true to Otis Toole, he took it all back. Then he confessed again. Then he took it back again. This was how he worked, and he did this over and over for years. So it was really hard to know whether he was telling the truth about something, had heard about it, someone had told him about it when he was in one of his jail stints, or whether or not he was just making this up to get attention. But to make matters worse, the car he said he used, I mean, this was the piece of evidence they wanted to get to verify if he was telling the truth. Well, police had destroyed it before anyone ever tested it. Evidence that could have told the truth, gone. And then you had his buddy, Henry Lee Lucas. He's another guy who confessed to hundreds of murders he didn't commit, claiming he did it too. So between those two, it was like watching a circus of lies. For John and Rive, it was torture. Every time they thought they might finally get the truth, it slipped away. And decades went by like that. The case just faded into the background, cold files in a box. But John, he did not stop. He never stopped pushing, never stopped learning. He never stopped asking for answers. He kept asking questions, kept digging. He talked to police. He talked to the media, politicians, anyone who could help him get the truth out. And finally, in 2008, Hollywood police, now this is Hollywood, Florida, reopened the old files, went through everything again, and said officially what most people had believed for years. Otis Toole was the responsible person for kidnapping and murdering their son Adam. But by then, Toole had been dead for over a decade. There was never going to be a trial, never going to be justice in the way that the Walsh family deserved. And that's the part that breaks your heart, because you want that moment when the bad guy faces the family. You want to be able to see the Walsh family look into his face and let him know what they thought of him, the scum that they thought of him. But you don't get that when it's not solved until years later and the perpetrator's dead. Family wanted accountability. You want to see someone pay for what they did. That moment never came. But John Walsh was not done. In fact, I would venture to say John Walsh was just getting started. He was not about to let his son's story end at this point. If he couldn't get justice in court, he was going to fight for something bigger, a way to make sure that this never happened to any family again, or that he had done everything he could to try to keep it from happening. And that's exactly what he did next. What came out of Adam's story wasn't just tragedy, it was change. Massive, real, nationwide change. When I tell you about the changes that Adam's death and his father's work led to, you're going to be shocked if you don't know this. The things that we did not have in 1981, John Walsh began treading through everything he could to make things change. And that's exactly what he did. It started with the one broken heart dad who refused to give up. When something like this happens, I can't even venture to think, but most people would just crumble. You read story after story of parents who've lost their children, whether it's to a crime or an accident or anything else. And you hear time after time those parents look at taking their own life. They go quiet, they hide, or they bury themselves in something else like an addiction, alcohol, drugs. Or they bury themselves in hobbies, jobs. They work themselves to death. And no one would ever blame them for doing that. This would be the hardest thing you'd ever face. But John Walsh was not built that way. He went the other way. He refused to let his little boy's name fade away. He once said he didn't want Adam to be just another picture on a missing child poster. One more story people would eventually forget. So instead of letting grief swallow him whole, and instead of letting it take over his life, he turned it into fuel. He started paying attention to what was broken, and he realized there was a lot broken in those days. There was no national system for missing children. If a child disappeared, there was no quick way to alert police in that state or nearby states. Every department was on its own. There was no national database, no central hotline, nothing. It was terrifying how disconnected everything was. And if you think back to some of the serial killer cases that you may be familiar with, cases like the Green River Killer, cases like Ed Kemper, cases like Ted Bundy, the Hillside Stranglers. Many of their crimes went unnoticed and untied to them, and they were allowed to do what they did for so long because there was no national system. In fact, there were situations where jurisdictions did not work with one another at all. No, this is our case, we'll handle it. Yes, but let's see if we've got anything else like that in here. Now, the Ted Bundy case, to its credit, did show different states and jurisdictions that they needed to work together. But even as late as the crimes with the Golden State Killer, D'Angelo, even as late as when those had stopped taking place and were being investigated, those jurisdictions had not put it all together either. It took a person who wrote a book and did research, Michelle McNamara, and this case killed her. That case, the D'Angelo case, killed her. It was her. It was her work with several other journalists who tied it all together and said, we're looking for the same person. He's just moved and escalated in his crimes. So keep that in mind when we talk about the changes that got made, because they were just phenomenal and they changed everything. And when I look back, it's so amazing, because I did grow up in a time when the Atlanta child murders were going on. And I remember how that had started to affect our communities. So Adam was never found, and he did die, and it was a horrible situation, but John just couldn't let that go. So he got to work. He lobbied lawmakers. He met with police chiefs and investigators. He spoke in front of Congress, not as a politician, but as a dad. And he didn't speak in fancy terms. He spoke like someone who'd lived the nightmare. I have been fortunate enough to hear John Walsh speak on more than one occasion. I've even met him once. And I can tell you what a brute force he is. He is passionate. He believes in justice. He believes in finding children as soon as they go missing, not waiting for something to happen. He has very strong beliefs, and he stands behind police, but only to the extent that they do their job. He's their worst critic, and he's their best ally. And a lot of that came about because of the pressure that he put on politicians. And he's a perfect example to show you how one person can make a major change across the entire United States. So he told Congress how long it took to get media attention, how many times he was told your son's probably just lost, kids run away all the time. He told them how impossible it was to get answers when every state had its own rules, every county, every jurisdiction. And eventually, people started listening. That's how in 1984, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was born. A place where police, media, and families could finally come together, share information, and actually coordinate searches nationwide. It was the first real step towards fixing a system that had failed thousands of families, and that came straight from John Walsh's fight for his son. But he didn't stop there. He realized that finding missing children was just one part of it. The other part was catching the people who hurt them. And again, when I heard him speak, every time, he makes no mistake about how he feels about predators. He doesn't make excuses for them. He doesn't pretend that a predator who preys on children will get better. He doesn't fall for the victim story. And he's known to call families out of the clear blue when he finds out that a family has lost their child. I've read case after case where parents have talked about being afraid to answer the phone because they were worried that it was media. And when they did answer it, it was John Walsh on the other end saying, "What can I do to help? Can I fly out there and be with you? Do you need, I'll offer whatever I can. And can we put it on TV?" Because you see, starting the National Center for Exploited and Missing Children, that was just one thing. Because he decided to do something about finding the people that harm children. So he created a television show. It was going to be a TV show that would track down criminals on the run live on television, and it was called America's Most Wanted. When it launched in 1988, people didn't know what to expect. Remember, reality TV was not the everyday thing. You had a few reality shows, but they weren't every show on every channel and every network. But when it launched, people were cautiously hopeful. We didn't know what to expect. We couldn't figure out if a TV show could really help bring fugitives and criminals to justice. And the executives were worried, would anyone even watch it? They watched. We all watched. And it worked. Within the first year, tips from viewers helped capture dozens of suspects. And over the decades that followed, the show helped arrest more than 1,100 dangerous fugitives and even locate missing children who'd been gone for years. Now, I want you just to think about that, because we take a lot of things for granted here in 2025. But I want you to think about not having the internet, not having streaming television or YouTube, not having Sirius radio or podcasts. None of that was around. So here's how we got our information. We waited for the newspaper or the nightly news. The nightly news was 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock. If you missed it at 6, sometimes you were lucky enough to see that story at 11, but sometimes they didn't repeat it. But you couldn't go just look it up, and there was no archive to be able to see it again. And people relied on the media back in this day and age. When the media said something, it came with facts. There was no political involvement in local media in those days. Your local news was about your local area, and it's how you stayed on top of things. They covered your weather. They covered the crimes. They covered the good stories, the happy things, the events. So John Walsh knew that people would watch television, and he knew that it was going to work, because by this time, John had talked to a lot of other parents who were frustrated and hurt and had lost their children. So he knew that other people were out there. And if he was talking to them, that was the tip of the iceberg. So just in that first year alone, they located missing children who had been gone for years. I mean, that is just unbelievable. And it's incredible when you think about it. All of this done from one man who refused to stop fighting. But he never acted like a hero. And again, if you ever heard him speak, you would know he's down to earth. He dresses down to earth. The times I saw him, he was wearing jeans. And I think he wore a black jacket or brown jacket. And he did not act like a celebrity. He spoke with the police. They went back and forth about some things, and then he introduced himself to people. And he asked people that had ever been in that situation to come forward. Now, I was in a group that had gone to hear him as a first responder back in my technology days. So for me, this was, cell phones had just come out, and his speech was all about how to make sure that your jurisdiction, I worked for a jurisdiction, that your jurisdiction handled what were being called at the time alerts on the phone. So, John was just John when he showed up. He told it like it was. He called the perpetrators what they were, and he didn't make excuses for it. And he's always said he was just doing what any parent would do if they had the means to help others. He turned pain into purpose, and it gave meaning to something that never should have happened in the first place. And that's what made him different. And it wasn't just John. His wife, Reve, she helped as well. She was instrumental behind the scenes while John was out in front of everybody. And their mission, again, wasn't about fame. It was about making sure that Adam's name stood for hope. It was making sure that no one forgot. And because of that, their son's legacy did not end in 1981. It was only the beginning of something much, much bigger. You know, the more you look at it and the more I think about it as I'm talking about it, the more I realize just how much changed because of Adam Walsh, because of one family who refused to back down. It's easy to forget now because we take so many things for granted. We've got so many of these things that are normal today, but back then none of them existed. And so let's start with the basics. After Adam's case, the United States finally realized it needed a central system for missing children. Now, had John and Reve not pushed it and not lobbied Congress and lobbied lawmakers, it may have not happened, or it may not have happened the way it happened. But their work was created when the United States finally realized it needed this system. And that's where the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children came in, thanks in large part to John and Reve Walsh. That center became the hub for everything: missing child alerts, age-progressed photos, tips from the public, and a national hotline that's still used to this day, 1-800-THE-LOST. That's 1-800-THELOST. That has not changed. And they moved from being a small organization to being a huge operation. But before that, every case was local. If a child disappeared across state lines, it was like they vanished from the map completely. Because one state didn't have anything to do with another state. And one state could not tell another state what to do. So if someone came from Florida to Georgia, the Georgia authorities and the Florida authorities were not necessarily going to agree with what needed to be done. By now, now in 2025, the minute a report comes in, it can go nationwide in seconds. And that is directly tied to John's fight. So after he created NCMEC, which is the National Center, he created Code Adam. That one hits close to home. You've probably heard a Code Adam announcement in a store before. It's when a child goes missing inside a business and the staff locks down exits immediately. It was created in Adam's name. Walmart was one of the first companies to adopt it nationwide, and now it's used in thousands of stores, amusement parks, and public places all over the country. That system has brought countless lost kids back to their parents safely. Because I want you to think about being a parent and being in a store, and your child or your grandchild slips away from you. Or you're looking at something, and the next thing you know, they're gone. With a Code Adam call, staff stops what they're doing immediately and starts looking for this child. So if you've got a perp who's about to walk out a door with this child, or is going over to the toy department with the child to get them something to keep them quiet and make it look like they're there naturally together, they're going to have a higher chance of being seen and that child returned to his parent, her parent, his parent. But John did not stop there. Okay, so now we've got the National Center. We've got a national television show. And the TV show was growing by leaps and bounds. Then we've got Code Adam. And now he starts pushing for better laws. Laws that make it harder for predators to hide. He helped get the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act passed in 2006. Now think about this. Adam died in 1981. It took him until 2006 to get this Safety Act passed. That's a lot of years. That law completely overhauled how the U.S. tracks and registers sex offenders. It created a national database, something that never existed before, so that offenders couldn't just move from one state to another and disappear. And that's exactly what a lot of people were doing. Serial killers were doing it. Sexual predators were doing it. Do you remember the faces on the milk cartons? Now that started in 1980s, in the mid 1980s, just a few years after Adam's case. It was part of the same wave of awareness that John and others helped spark. It was a grassroots type of movement to make sure missing kids were seen. Now, you don't see that these days because we've got everything else. We've got the internet, we got everything. But back in those days, most people drank their milk out of a carton, not a gallon plastic jug. So it was the perfect opportunity to announce a missing child. The child's face and information will go on the milk carton, and that milk from the dairy lands across America could go everywhere. I mean, what a beautiful way to get the message out. It's one more marketing, in a sense, to get the message out about a missing child. It was part of the same wave of awareness that John and others got going for so many other programs, not just the milk carton program. But the photos made an entire country start paying attention, and it worked. Children were actually found because someone recognized them from those cartons. That whole era, the Missing Child's Network, the posters, the media attention, it all ties back to the awareness that came out of the Adam Walsh case. And there's something else that often gets overlooked. John did not just fight for his own child. He helped other families through theirs. He worked closely with the family of Polly Klaas, a 12-year-old California girl who was kidnapped in her home in 1993. John stood beside Polly's father, Mark, using his platform to push for the 3 strikes law in California and tougher sentencing for repeat offenders. He gave support to the family of Elizabeth Smart, who was kidnapped in 2002 in Utah and later found alive. John featured her case on America's Most Wanted, bringing national attention that helped keep her story in the public eye, and it helped put pressure on investigators. He also supported families in cases like J.C. Dugard, Amber Hagerman, the little girl whose name became the Amber Alert System, and so many others. John always made it clear that this wasn't just about one tragedy. It was about building a system that would outlive all of these, something permanent and something powerful. And then there's the media side, the part that changed how the public gets involved in catching criminals. America's Most Wanted wasn't just a TV show. It was a national crime-fighting machine. For over 25 years, John Walsh stood in front of that camera and told stories of fugitives and missing people, and he asked for help. And the public delivered. More than 60 missing children were found and reunited with their families, and countless tips helped solve cases that law enforcement had completely given up on. That's the type of ripple effect most people can only dream about leaving behind. Now, no one wants tragedy to lead into something like this, but talk about leaving a legacy as a result of a tragedy. Talk about working something for the good of others. And even after America's Most Wanted ended its original run, John didn't stop. He went on to create The Hunt with John Walsh on CNN, and later In Pursuit with John Walsh on Investigation Discovery. And he co-hosts those with his now grown son, Callahan. Callahan has become another force in keeping new laws coming out that protect children, shows nationwide that help find them. Together, they've continued the mission, giving victims and families a voice, shining light on cold cases, and reminding us all that justice doesn't expire just because time passes and just because technology grows and changes. When you really step back and look at it, the legacy of Adam isn't just about one crime or one family. It's about how one father and his determination, the family determination, reshaped how we protect our children, how we pursue justice for our children, and how we respond when someone goes missing. Because before Adam, there was chaos. There was nothing. After Adam, there was a system, and that system has saved thousands of lives. So let's talk about this for a second. It's one thing to talk about laws and how you got a law passed or you lobbied Congress to get a law passed. And it's another thing to talk about programs that maybe you were instrumental in having built and systems that you helped pull together, like the nationwide system, the Amber Alert, and other programs. Or Code Adam, I should say. He helped with the Amber Alert, but he wasn't the he wasn't the party that pushed it the hardest. But the real proof of what John Walsh built, the thing that showed the world just how powerful it could be, came from the cases that were resolved by his advocacy. Over the years, America's Most Wanted, for example, helped solve thousands of crimes, but there are a few that everyone remembers, cases that made headlines and changed families' lives and proved that a television show could actually catch killers and find the missing, and it proved that people really did care. So let's just talk about a couple of them. Elizabeth Smart. In 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was taken from her bedroom in Salt Lake City, Utah, while her younger sister lay beside her. It's a true story, and that really is the way it happened. There were a lot of rumors about, well, no, that couldn't have happened that way. Yes, she was literally taken from her bed as her sister was asleep beside her. So it can and does happen. And the story gripped the nation. A family desperate, a community was terrified, and the police were searching for answers with no leads. This is in 2002. A lot's changed since 1981. But for 9 months, Elizabeth was gone. The case went cold until her face appeared again and again on national TV, including America's Most Wanted. John Walsh made sure people did not forget her. He didn't let her name fade like so many others, and when new leads came in, the public recognized her abductors, Brian David Mitchell, and Wanda Barzee from the broadcast. Elizabeth was found alive in March of 2003, walking down a street in Sandy, Utah. 9 months of horror, and finally she was going home. To this day, Elizabeth Smart herself, because she has become an advocate, has said that keeping her story in the public eye was what made it impossible for her captors to stay hidden and possible for her to come home. America's Most Wanted was a huge part of that. And again, this also created an advocate in Elizabeth Smart. She now does national speeches, she does talks, and she helps other survivors who have survived abduction. Let's talk about the second case I want to bring to your attention. This one's going to send chills down your spine too. So another trigger alert. I know we always give a trigger alert at the beginning before we start, but trigger alert here again. 1971, a man named John List murdered his wife, his mother, and his 3 children in their New Jersey mansion. And then he took off. He vanished. Now, if you've never heard of the story of John List, it's worthy of its own episode, but the bottom line is he was way too devoutly, I don't want to say devoutly religious is a bad thing. He had taken it to an unhealthy level. He believed that every sin was going to damn his family to hell. That was his story. But what was really happening behind the scenes is he was living outside his means, and he was about to lose his job or had lost his job, and debt was piling up, His mother lived with them, and she was not the most easy person to live with from all sources. She was very hard on him and his family. And his wife was very hard on him as well and liked the high life and liked to spend. And the thought of him losing the home that his mother and wife wanted so much and that lifestyle that his children had gotten used to. But the thing is, he was so locked down as it related to his children. He believed that if his daughter was dating someone, she was definitely going to hell. And these were beliefs that he really did have. The money issues is what drove him to it, but he really did have these very crazy beliefs because the friends of the children talked about how they were not allowed to go places. They were not allowed to do things. This was in 1971. This is not the 50s. But if you see him and the children, they were dressed like the 50s, haircuts like the 50s, the mother dressed like the 50s. I mean, these people never advanced past the 50s into the 70s. But the kids did, and they were trying. They were trying to change their clothing style. They were trying to be more hip, as they called it, and cool. And they didn't want to stand out and look different. But John wasn't having any part of that. So, this is what happened. As a result of all of the financial stuff swirling around and all of the crazy beliefs, he decided it would be better to call the kids' school and say that they were going to be out of school for a while because they were going on a vacation. He also waited until each one came home from school that last day. Now, remember, he'd already called in an excuse for the rest of the time. But for this day, they're coming home. He waited as one by one, each one of them arrived, and he killed each one. He had already murdered his wife, his mother, and then as each child came in, he killed them. And then he laid them, wife and children, in a line in the middle of the floor, and he turned off all of the heat. It was wintertime, and he turned off all of the heat so that they would be preserved longer. And he canceled the newspaper deliveries. He called and put in a thing, or not called, but went to the post office and suspended his postal deliveries and asked them to hold it till he got back. And then he vanished. So when the authorities first got there, they thought that he had taken his family's life and then probably taken his own life as well. And the family would not have been found for a much longer time, but someone, a neighbor, I believe it was, walked up to the home, and they realized that they had not seen anyone and something was going on. And so they called the police. And I don't remember if they looked in a window and found them or the police found them, but at any rate, it was directly because of America's Most Wanted. I'm about to tell you that. For nearly 18 years, no one knew where John was. And he had completely reinvented himself. He had a new name, a new city, a new life, and he disappeared off the face of the earth. But, I mean, he was remarried. And it looks like history was about to repeat itself because he was in trouble financially again in that same set of circumstances. But America's Most Wanted got involved. And in 1989, the show ran his story, featured a forensic clay bust showing what List might look like after all those years. And that episode aired nationwide. And I remember this. This was it was an unbelievable episode because you did not have age progression photos at that time. And this guy, I think his last name was Bender, he was well known for creating these busts. And it was like a clay bust to look like the person. That episode aired nationwide. And 2 weeks later, a neighbor in Richmond, Virginia called in a tip. And she said, the man living next door, he's a quiet type of guy. He's an accountant. His name's Robert Clark, but he looked exactly like that sculpture. Now, the episode was a made-for-TV show, I think, back in the day. It talked about this woman, going to the wife and saying, I think this is your husband. Look at this. Now, I want you just to imagine this for a second. I know I'm going on a tangent, but this is interesting. Imagine you are married to someone, and you've been married 15 years or so, or maybe 10, maybe even 5, but you know them very well. You spend every day with them. You see them, you know them, and you rely on them. They rely on you. And your neighbor comes over and says, I just saw something really disturbing on America's Most Wanted. And it looks like your husband. It looks like a guy named John List who killed his entire family and left in 1971. Now imagine, you're going, you're crazy. This is not my husband. You're messing with me. And it is. It really is John List. And that's exactly what happened. So he was arrested, he was tried, he was convicted, he was sentenced to 5 life terms in prison. He's probably dead by now. But all because one person watched America's Most Wanted that night, recognized him from living next door, or a neighbor. I don't know if it's next door, but a neighbor, and picked up the telephone. That's the power that this program had then, because there was nothing else like it. Now let's talk about Angela Hammond. Angela Hammond was a 20-year-old woman who was abducted from a small town in Missouri in 1991. She was 4 months pregnant when she was taken, and her boyfriend tried desperately to chase the kidnapper's truck, but lost him. And the case really bothered the community for years. When America's Most Wanted aired her story, it generated a flood of tips, one of which eventually helped police identify the suspect, Rob Schaefer, who confessed and was later connected to other crimes. Angela was never found, but the show gave the family answers, and it gave justice for other victims because of those crimes he was connected with. Let's talk about Carlina White. One of the most incredible stories to ever come through America's Most Wanted was Carlina White. Carlina was kidnapped as a newborn baby from a Harlem hospital in 1987. Her parents were told the baby had disappeared without a trace. Years later, Carlina began to suspect that she wasn't who she was told she was. She didn't have a birth certificate, she had no baby pictures, and she had a lot of questions. She started digging online because, this is many years later. And she found a photo of a missing child on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's website, and that child looked just like her. That photo had been circulated thanks to America's Most Wanted. Carlina reached out, had DNA tests done, and 23 years after she was kidnapped, she was reunited with her biological parents. Now, I want you to put yourself in those parents' shoes. Imagine 23 years later, all you've had is hope. And bam, she walks in the door. Or the police call you and you meet them down at the station, or however it happens. That's the kind of ending that people who have lost someone dream about. And that actually happened. And it was all because of that show. Okay, final case we're going to talk about is David James Roberts. He was a convicted killer who escaped from an Indiana prison in 1986. He was serving time for murdering a family and setting their house on fire. He was one of the first fugitives ever featured on America's Most Wanted. After the episode aired, a viewer recognized him from the broadcast and turned him in. He had been living quietly, They always live quietly after they've done a bunch of bad stuff under a fake name in New York. In less than a month after the episode aired, he was back in custody. That was the very first fugitive ever captured because of the show. And it set the tone for everything that came after, because after he was captured, people understood the power that this show had, the value that this show had. They understood that people were actually watching around the nation, and that if they had someone that was missing and could get their picture out there and their story out there, they stood a chance of at least getting some answers, keeping it in the public's eye. Now, America's Most Wanted has done a reboot of sorts the last few years, and I know that there were several popular people on there, like Paul Holes and a couple of others. And they've pulled in specialists now in different areas, like DNA, in missing persons, profilers. So it's really gone into a new thing beyond just reciting the case and showing the information. It really has become more interactive. Now, I don't know if it's still going on. I haven't seen it recently, but it may still be online because so many shows are online now. But each one of these cases, Elizabeth Smart, John List, Angela Hammond, Carlina White, and David James Roberts, they all have one big thing in common. Someone watched, someone recognized, and someone acted. What is it we always say? If you see something, say something. That was the whole idea behind America's Most Wanted. John has always said, you can make a difference from your living room. And he was right. Because time and time again, viewers picked up the phone, made that call, and brought people home or brought killers to justice. That's not just television. That's impact. And it all started with one little boy named Adam Walsh. When you think back on everything we've talked about, the fear, the heartbreak, the fight, the change, the justice, it's hard not to feel the weight of it. I'm sure it's weighed very heavily on John all throughout the years. I'm sure it's weighed heavily on Reve, his wife. Now, I believe they are divorced now and maybe remarried to other people. But even as individuals, imagine the weight of the work that they did. Every time you lobby Congress to have a law passed, you're mentioning your child's name, knowing that he's not with you anymore. Every time you speak on an episode of America's Most Wanted, you're reminded of that little boy that only held 6 years of your life, and he was gone. In 1981, one little boy disappeared inside a department store, and the entire country changed. Adam Walsh's story wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to become a turning point, but it did because his parents refused to let him be forgotten. Now, they ended up having a couple more children. Callahan is one of them. I believe they've got a daughter, and I don't know if the daughter is involved as an advocate. I haven't heard much about her, but I know Callahan is an advocate and a very strong person who works with other leaders in law enforcement and things like that to help families bring home their missing and lost. But it's just amazing to know that John and Reve took their pain and turned it into power. They took a tragedy that could have destroyed them, and they built something that saved thousands of children, maybe tens of thousands. When a child goes missing today, alerts go out in minutes. Photos flash across every screen, every phone, every store. Law enforcement agencies work together seamlessly. Now, there are still problems, but for the most part, from one state to another, one country to another. That's because of the Adam Walsh story, and it's because of Adam Walsh. John once said he didn't want to be remembered for catching fugitives. He wanted to be remembered for giving families hope. And I think that's exactly what he's done. Because through America's Most Wanted, through The Hunt, through In Pursuit, through every interview and every single plea he's made on camera, you can hear that fire in his voice. He doesn't temper it for anyone. He's the same father who lost his son, and he's still fighting for someone else's. I read just less than a month ago a case where a woman had lost her child. And she turned to the police and said, I just don't know what to do. I don't know who to turn to. There's got to be something more that I can do. And the police officer in the case was a detective of missing persons. And this was in a fairly large jurisdiction, but I really don't remember where. And he said, have you thought about reaching out to John Walsh? She said, John Walsh, the guy that started America's Most Wanted? Well, isn't he retired? How would I get in touch with him? And he said, you just hang tight. She got a phone call on her cell phone, not 24 hours later, and the voice on the other end said to her, whatever her name was, I think it was Lisa or Melissa, Melissa, this is John Walsh, and I'm on a plane headed to your state, to your home, to help you find your child. How long has it been and what all have you done? And they had a 5 or 10 minute conversation. He came to her home. She said he didn't come in to like the press or notoriety. He walked in like her next door neighbor would and said, and walked straight to her, hugged her, and cried with her and said, we've got work to do. Now, her child was found, but was not found alive. But she was able to get justice. They were able to find the perpetrator. And she said John Walsh's support that day, and he only stayed about a day, she said was more valuable than anything, because she thought she was coming out of her skin. And he was there to hold her hand and tell her, you're going to do this. You can do this. And you deserve answers. There's no telling how many other advocates he's created, from people that either got their child back and decided to be an advocate, or people like Mark Klaus, who lost his daughter Polly because the jurisdictions weren't working together. And she could have been found. He became an advocate. And there's so many others out there that are advocates. And it's because one person set the tone and said, I will not go quietly. In fact, I'm not going away at all. I'm going to change everything. He stood beside survivors like Elizabeth Smart, helping amplify their voices.
Welcome to Case by
And
Case.
he's continued working with families of missing and murdered children.
You that
and when they
this
don't
content
have
is
resources
intended for adult audiences.
That's another thing.
It is created for educational and informational
He
purposes
doesn't just
only.
come
Viewer
with
discretion
him.
is advised.
He comes
as
with a
discussions
plan,
may
and
include
he comes
references
with the
to real
resources
criminal cases,
to be able
violence,
to pick
and
up the
other
phone and
sensitive and
say,
potentially
get this out
distressing
on this
topics.
station,
While we
get this
strive
out
to
on the
present every
internet,
case
get
with
this up on
accuracy
this,
and respect those involved,
all in a
the
minute.
material may not be suitable for all viewers. Please proceed thoughtfully.
He knows what
And
silence
remember,
feels like.
if you
And he
need to
never
take a
wants
step
another
back,
family to go through it
if you
again.
find something
The legacy of Adam Walsh
that
isn't a
concerns
case
you,
number.
if
It
you
isn't
find it
just
to
a
be
headline from
triggering and you need to
1981.
take a step back,
It's a reminder that one
please
person,
do.
even in their
You
darkest
can
moment,
join
can
us
change an entire
whenever
system.
you're ready to come
From
back.
Code Adam to Amber
We'll
Alert,
leave the light
from the
on.
Missing Children's Network to the laws that protect our kids today, every bit of it carries some part of Adam's name somewhere inside it. And that's powerful. That's hope built from heartbreak. So the next time you're in a store and you hear a Code Adam alert, or you see an Amber Alert flash across your phone, take a second and remember where that came from. And really look at the photos and make sure that you've not seen anything, you've not heard anything. Remember a little boy with a bright smile. Remember his parents who refused to stay quiet. And remember that sometimes the strongest voices come from the deepest pain. I'm Terry, and this has been the story of Adam, John, and Reve Walsh. Adam was the boy who changed the way America protects its children, and the father who turned loss into a lifelong mission to save others. Thank you for listening to Case by Case.